Introduction to clay. Why does clay matter? The first two answers are in this video.
Clay is one of the most universal materials known to humans. Throughout history and around the world, people have developed the art of forming clay to make ceramic objects, also known as pottery. Clay is made of just two simple ingredients, water and earth. It's formed into different shapes, with tools and by hand, and when the clay is formed, high levels of heat harden it to create a sturdy ceramic object. Early pottery was heated in the sun or by a fire. Later on, potters developed special ovens called kilns to control the firing conditions. This is what you'll see being used in a pottery studio or an art classroom. Early cultures used clay to make containers that could hold water. That meant that they could cook and store foods like vegetables and meats. Improving food quality meant larger populations could survive. Once a ceramic bowl or cup is made, it can be decorated with color and with designs. Pottery is an art form that grew out of the daily needs of life. Fired pottery is solid and durable, and it can last for up to tens of thousands of years. Because of this, ceramics are an important source of information for historians and for archaeologists. Pieces of ceramics found in the earth help tell us about ancient cultures. They're like an ancient encyclopedia, answering questions about the lives of those who've lived in the past. Clay has been around for almost all of human history, and it's still being used in new and exciting ways today. When you make a pinch pot or a clay sculpture, you're creating an artifact that could be found by someone hundreds of years in the future. When we work with clay, we're carrying on the traditions of our ancestors. We're remembering the crafts of past civilizations, and at the same time, we're making a new and beautiful piece of art.
Let's talk about the history of clay. It is incredibly old. In fact, it's one of the oldest art forms known to human beings. We have found evidence of the use of clay from 30,000 years ago. It was the Dolní Věstonice archaeological site, which is in what is the Czech Republic today. Obviously, the Czech Republic didn't exist 30,000 years ago. What's so cool about the pieces we found at this site is that it's not just clay. The people who were making it were hunting mammoths at the time, and they would take the mammoth bones they found, crush them, and add them to the clay to change the texture and consistency of the clay. What also is amazing is that, yes, we found figurines that had been fired and turned into a more stone-like substance, but we also found unfired clay. And unfired clay can still melt when exposed to water. And it's amazing that they have lasted the last 30,000 years. Many of the earliest pieces we find we call Venus figures, and they always depict rather unrealistic but very curvy female figures. We also find these wonderful animal figurines, and it's a great insight into some of the animals that people in this area of Eastern Europe might have encountered over 30,000 years ago. For instance, you can see that they may have encountered lions, what could be a form of bison, bears, and even, unbelievably, rhinoceri. Now, those figurines weren't what we now consider to be functional objects. The first functional vessels we find 16,500 years ago at the Odai Yamamoto archaeological site, which is in modern-day Japan. If you look at these two examples of pieces that have lasted that long, it's incredible the amount of detail they put into these pieces. You can tell the amount of pride they took in their work. Yes, these are functional vessels whose purpose is to hold food or liquid, but they didn't make them simple. They put so much artistry into them. It's incredible that we have these examples from so long ago. Now, by 13,000 years ago, we're not just finding individual pieces. We're finding pieces everywhere that makes us think that by that point, pottery was in major production in Japan. They used these vessels for food production and storage, and as you can see, there's just incredible, intricate decoration on them. Now, glazes are what coat and often waterproof a piece of pottery. The first glazes we have evidence of come from 4,000 years ago, and interestingly, we find them in China and Egypt at around the same time. These Egyptian glazes were so cool. What happened was the clay themselves that they took out of the ground had sodium salts mixed in. As the clays dried, the water would move from the interior of the clay to the surface of the clay and bring those salts with it. Those salts would be left on the surface as kind of a crystallized crust, and then when the pieces were fired or cooked, those salts turned into this absolutely stunning teal that we see in these pieces here. Now, in China, this happened a little bit differently. The Egyptian glazes were kind of a happy accident. In China, they were firing their pottery in wood-fired kilns, and they noticed that when they took their pieces out, the wood ash that had been floating around in the air during firing had landed on the pots and turned into this melted, shiny surface that gave it kind of cool patterns too. And so they took what they had seen and they decided to try it out on purpose. They experimented with what was happening naturally. They took the wood ash, pre-mixed it with water, and painted it on as a type of slurry, and they learned how to control the effect of that wood ash on their pottery so that they could create different patterns and colors. The next video we watch is just going to introduce us to some very basics of how we work with clay and how clay works. This video has no answers that are in your notes, so sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Clay Corner Studio's online classes on hand building ceramics. Today we'll be sharing with you some basic information about the different stages of clay and what kind of tools you should have in your studio if you're just starting, as well as some essential tips and tricks on how to store, wedge, and clean up clay in your workspace. Natural clay comes in three main ranges: earthenware, which is low-fired, stoneware, which is mid-fired, and porcelain, which is high-fired. Each of these types of clays go through different stages as they dry. When the clay is soft and malleable, it is called plastic clay because you can easily bend it and work with it without breaking and cracking. Plastic clay is ideal for coiling, pinching, and wedging, and can take on texture very well. Keep in mind that soft clay is not wet clay. As it dries a little, the clay enters the leather stage, when it is no longer sticky to the touch and can hold its shape when standing upright. At this stage, you can still get away with shaping it and bending it a little without cracking. Leather clay is ideal for slab building and for scoring and slipping, or in other words, attaching two pieces together. The next stage is leather hard, and it is when the clay can no longer be bent, but it is not yet completely dry. This stage is great for cleaning up and polishing the piece, such as smoothing it down with a wet sponge or trimming and carving. When the clay is completely dry, it is called bone dry. At this stage, you can no longer bend, attach, or shape it. However, you can still buff and sand it. The piece is quite fragile at this stage and not functional until fired. One use for bone dry clay is making slip. Slip is a liquid or paste form of the clay, which is made using bone-dry clay and water, since bone-dry clay absorbs water much faster than any other stage of clay. Slip can be used like glue to attach pieces of clay together. or sometimes be used to slip cast into plaster molds. Pieces made with clay in all its stages before firing are called greenware and are not yet ceramic pieces. The first firing that clay goes through to become ceramic is called a bisque firing. Ceramics are fired in a kiln, which is an oven made for ceramics that fires to very high temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Firing can happen at different ranges for different types of clays and glazes. Once bisque fired, the unglazed ceramic piece is called a bisque, and it is not yet functional or food safe until it is glazed and fired again. After glaze firing, you now have a completed ceramic ware.
Okay, let's talk about what clay is, where it comes from. Clay has 3 main ingredients in it. It's a soft, loose, earthy, fine-grained natural soil material. It's a type of soil that comes out of the ground. It just happens to be the finest soil that exists on Earth with the smallest particles. That's what makes it so smooth. Here are the 3 ingredients of clay that I want you to remember. 1, clay has minerals in it. What type of minerals? Clay minerals. That's pretty easy. Clay also has traces of metal in it, but it's metal that has been exposed to oxygen over time and has oxidized. Oxidization is when metal has started to be corroded by being exposed to oxygen. So for instance, if you have iron and it is exposed to the air, it becomes iron oxide, otherwise known as rust. And then the 3rd ingredient it has is organic materials. And we're not talking about organic as in your parents go to the store and decide to get organic fruit because it has fewer pesticides on it. We're talking about organic in terms of chemistry. In chemistry, organic means 2 different things. It means carbon-based, as in things that are made out of carbon. And, at least on our planet, all life is carbon-based. That is how life, at its most fundamental aspect, is structured. So, when we talk about organic material being in clay, we're talking about things, mainly plants, but sometimes animals as well, that used to be alive and then died and sunk into the soil, and those get caught up into our clay materials. Now, if you look at the picture on the right, this is very cool. If you head down to the south end, especially if you have dogs, there is a beautiful beach called Double Bluff Beach. It's sandy, it's shallow, it goes on for miles. And when you walk down the beach past all of the trees on the cliffs to where there's a bend in the beach, you'll start finding these exposed cliffs. In the summertime, they turn more into sand dunes, but especially in the winter, like in this picture, the sand tends to wash away, and what is exposed, slowly eroding and falling from the cliff face, sometimes in pretty scary avalanches, are what look like rocks. But they're not rocks. They are giant, pure chunks of clay. And so if you go to Double Bluff Beach on the south end, you can actually collect as much of that natural clay as you want to. What I did, because it's heavy, is I paddleboarded down the beach line to the cliff, took buckets and backpacks, filled them up with the clay, put them on my paddleboard, and then paddled back to as close as I could get to the parking lot. Okay, there are 3 stages to pottery that you guys are all going to become very intimate with in this class. The first stage of clay is called greenware. Greenware is clay that we have not exposed to heat yet. We haven't fired it yet. And because of that, if you decide that you don't want the piece that you've been working on, or you messed up, or you want to start over, or if your piece just dries out, it doesn't matter, because that clay can always be broken down, remixed with water, and recycled into fresh clay. Now, once we fire your clay and turn it into stone, we call it bisqueware. And that is clay that has been fired in the kiln once. Once your bisqueware comes out of the kiln, we can then coat it with a glaze. We do that for a number of reasons, one of which is that glazes can make your piece food safe by sealing the pores of the bisqueware. The other thing is to add color and decoration. Now, we have 3 stages of clay. We also have 3 stages of greenware, and this is what you're going to be working with the most. If you remember, greenware is clay that has not been fired yet, so it can still be broken down at any stage, wet to dry, and recycled back into fresh clay. The first stage of greenware we either called plastic or wet. Now, we're not talking about plastic like hard plastic. The word plastic actually means moldable or stretchable. So we're talking about the fact that plastic can be molded into any shape you want it to, at least when it's warm still. Wet and plastic clay is soft, it's cold, and it can be molded into anything you want. It is also incredibly frustrating. It's like working with wet bread dough almost, in that you can't get any detail into it. The reason we love working with wet clay is because we can sketch out our rough form, the rough shape we want, and then move on. Now, once our clay starts to stiffen up and loses a little bit of its moisture, it holds its shape better, and because it's not so stretchy and smushy, we can start carving really fine detail into the surfaces. This is the stage of clay that is the most satisfying to work with. The way you know if it's still leather hard is that when you touch it, it should still feel cold, and that's because it still has water in it that is evaporating. Now, the last stage of greenware, and this is the stage that it has to be before we put it in the kiln, is called bone dry. And there's a couple reasons that we call it bone dry. One is that bones that have been left out in the sun can often become very brittle, and bone dry clay is very brittle. I'm guessing another reason we call it bone dry clay is because once all of the water evaporates from the clay, it usually turns to a very light gray or to almost a white color that looks very bone-like. Now, we know that our pieces have turned completely bone dry when they aren't cold anymore, because that tells us all of the water has evaporated, and so there's no cold coming off of the piece anymore due to evaporation. Okay, here's what we're going to be learning. You guys are going to be doing 3 major projects, and then for the 4th section of our class, you guys will be glazing and decorating all of your pieces. And that's really where the color theory that we've been studying comes into play. So the first technique, and this is the most fundamental technique of all hand building in clay, one of the oldest techniques that exists. This is called pinching, or the pinch technique. This is when you use your fingers to pinch out the form that you want, the form meaning your 3D shape, from a ball of clay. The second technique we will be exploring is the coil technique. And this is when we roll out long ropes or snakes of clay and we wrap them on top of each other to build whatever form we want. And then the last technique we're going to learn is the slab technique. This is where we roll out flat slabs or sheets of clay, kind of like you would do with cookie dough that you wanted to cut into different shapes. And then once we've cut out our shapes, we put them together to build the form we want. All right, let's take a look at the tools we're going to be using in this class. Now, here's the good thing about most vocabulary in pottery. Pottery is one of the most ancient art forms known to humans, and because of that, the tools are still pretty simple, and the names for the tools have been passed down throughout hundreds and thousands of generations of human beings. So the first tool that is incredibly versatile for carving and shaping your tool has a loop of metal inserted into a handle. So we call it a loop tool. Pretty basic. These are really interesting. We call these flat-shaped tools rib tools, and we make rib tools now out of both wood, plastic, and metal. But there's a really interesting history behind this. The reason we call them rib tools is because ancient humans actually used animal ribs to scrape their clay. And that's because if they wanted to create a nice curve, say to a vessel or a bowl, animal ribs already have that nice curve to them, and they can be carved to create a nice sharp surface, and they are hard enough that they will scrape into the clay without bending. And so that is where the term rib tools come from. Now, luckily for us, we just use different materials and we can shape them to any outline we want to work with. All right, here's another really simple one. We take a needle and we stick it in a wooden handle and we call it a needle tool. These are really good for drawing, slicing, doing stippling marks, and so forth. Again, super simple. We have a bunch of molding tools made out of wood, and we call them wooden tools or wood tools. Another one, we have a piece of wire that we use to cut clay, and we call it a wire tool. Now this one is one of the few vocabulary terms that's a little more complicated, and it is basically like a cheese knife. It's not very sharp, but we can use it to slice off small pieces of clay. We can use it to scrape clay and to mold clay. We call this a fettling knife. This one's pretty simple. We don't use these to hit people. We use these to shape our clay and to compress the clay molecules. The denser the clay molecules are, the closer they are together, the stronger they are. And that's why we use a wooden paddle. Now, we have a bunch of banding wheels in our glaze room that you guys will be welcome to use. These are kind of like Lazy Susans or cake trays that rotate, and you can put your piece on top of it and rotate it so that you can access all sides easily. Again, you guys know what these are. These are rolling pins. We can use them to roll out slabs of clay. However, you guys are super lucky. Most studios do not have slab rollers because they are very expensive. We do have one, and when we start our slab project, you guys will have to show me that you can roll out a nice even slab with a rolling pin, because most of you at home, that's all you're going to have access to. But after you show me that, you will be able to use our slab roller, which will roll out a nice sheet of clay at any thickness you want, and it makes your life way easier and your projects way faster to construct. This is my baby, and you will see it in the back of class. It actually has a pug face on it. This is called a pug mill, and this is priceless. These machines start at about $13,000, and most studios can't afford to have them. We are very lucky to have a pug mill because it recycles our clay for us. It's basically like a bread machine with a big auger, a big corkscrew arm on the inside that mixes our clay for us. The main difference is this: bread mixers are trying to mix air into the clay, and pug mills are trying to take air out of the clay. It's similar to a pug, actually an animal pug, in that it is pretty delicate. It has a delicate constitution. If you put in clay chunks that are hard or dry, that are more than an inch wide in any direction, it can choke just like a pug does. When it's all done, if you see where the rubber cap is, it poops out long logs of brand new, fresh clay. If we didn't have this pug mill, we would have to soak our clay in buckets of water, spread it out on plaster, and hand wedge every single piece of clay we wanted to use again. We are very lucky to not have to do that. Now, we put our clay in what is essentially a large electric oven. We call our clay ovens kilns. We have 3 of them that I will show you in use, and then outside in what we call the cage, we have a very large kiln that is gas powered that we call Hansel and Gretel. All right, this is another fantastic tool that you guys are going to enjoy using. When we get to our coil projects, you guys are going to be rolling out nice long ropes or snakes of clay to wrap around to build with. However, that can get pretty tedious and annoying to do after a while, so we have what is called an extruder hanging on the back wall, and it basically acts like a Play-Doh fun factory. You put a little disc with a cutout in the bottom that we call a die, and we have lots of different dies for different shapes. You put the collar on the bottom to hold the die. You stick your clay in, put the lever in, squeeze down, and those perfect shapes come out. All right, let's talk about some very basics of how to work with clay. We're gonna stick to just the fundamentals right now, so you have a general idea of what you can do with clay as you start planning out your first project. As we actually begin building, I'll be giving you guys more specific techniques to help you with the details. Okay, you are going to be wanting to make attachments. In other words, you're going to be able to take 2 pieces of clay and stick them together. Now here's the tricky part. If you take 2 pieces of clay and just stick them together without doing anything to them, they will stick. But that's because the water in the clay is acting as temporary glue. As soon as that water evaporates, those pieces are going to break apart. So, in order to actually attach clay permanently to another piece, you have to go through this process. First, we use a comb or a fork and we make deep score marks, deep Tyrannosaurus Rex claw marks into the clay. This creates a kind of Velcro between the 2 pieces that will stick together more evenly. And you have to make nice, deep score marks for this to work. Next, you want to add some glue. And in this class, water is glue. Now, as we work farther on our projects and your projects start to become leather hard, remember that is stiffer with less water in it, we'll start using slip. Remember, slip is liquidy clay. and the slip has both the water and the clay molecules to act as a glue or bridge between the two pieces. Next, you have your scored and slipped pieces. You line up the surfaces that are going to mesh together, and you press them firmly together, but that's not enough to make them stick. You have to wiggle the two pieces back and forth against each other to really get those clay molecules to lock onto each other and to make sure that there's no air left in the seam. That's going to leave a really ugly seam, and we don't want that. When we're finished, we want our clay piece to look like we started with a solid block of clay and carved everything out of it. So that's when you're going to use a rib tool and possibly even a sponge to refine the seam until it is completely invisible. Here are some important rules to remember to make sure your projects are successful. There's nothing more frustrating than going through an entire project, being really excited about it, and then having it blow up in the kiln. We very, very rarely have pieces blow up in the kiln at our school, and it's because we follow these rules. So, the first rule, in our class, I will not load any pieces that have any areas that are thicker than a 1/2 inch. That is because water can get trapped inside the thicker parts of the clay. It doesn't have the time to evaporate entirely. Some people think it's actually the air bubbles that explode. It's not. It is the moisture inside the air that expands and then blows the clay particles apart. Kind of like when you boil a pot on your stove and have a lid on it, and if you don't pay attention to it, the expanding water turning into gas can actually knock the lid off the top of the pot. And that is why we can't have any trapped air pockets, which means you might decide to build a panda bear, and you want the panda bear's torso to be hollow inside because it can't be thicker than 1/2 inch. But if you make a hollow sphere with no way for the air and the moisture inside the air to escape, then you will have created a little bomb to go in the kiln. And not only will it damage your piece, ruining it, it can also damage other students' pieces as well. So anytime we create hollow spheres or hollow shapes, we have to carve in a hole to let the gas escape. And we can integrate that into the design of the piece. If you're creating an animal, for instance, the hole could be a nose, it could be in the ear, it could be in an actual butt of the piece. Or if you want, we can always put the hole at the bottom of the piece where it won't be seen. We call the bottom of the piece where it touches the shelf or your table, we call that the foot of the piece or the butt of the piece. This is very important, and this is what you guys are going to have to practice balancing, especially with your first piece. We use water to smooth our clay surface out. That's one of the only ways to get a very smooth surface. However, if the bottom of your piece, if any of the surfaces of your piece look shiny, it means there's too much water there. And if we let the piece sit with water in it and we let it stay shiny, that water is going to trickle down through your clay and dissolve all of the really fine clay particles away. While your clay is wet, you won't be able to see anything. But then when we fire it, we will end up with cracks in your piece. The other important thing to do is to compress your clay. Compressing means pushing down on the clay to push all of the clay molecules closer together. This is especially important in the bottom or the base of your piece. You need to get down there with your fingers or even with a sponge, and you need to press down on the clay to make it very, very tightly compacted. This is what you need to do to avoid cracks that will form if those particles aren't packed nice and tight. Okay, let's talk about crusties. This is one of the things you will be scored on for all of your pieces. When we're working with wet clay, no matter what we do, when we carve into it, some of the clay is pushed over to the edges of our marks and our lines, and they create what has different names all around the world. People call them crusties, crumblies, boogers, burrs. There's so many names to them. There's 2 reasons that we will not tolerate crusties on any of your pieces. The first reason is it looks ugly. It looks unfinished and unintentional. The second reason is that those little crusties, when they're fired, they shrink down and they become incredibly sharp enough to slice your finger open. So it's very important to remove crusties before they go in a kiln. One way we can avoid creating really thick crusties is drawing with a pencil or even a ballpoint pen when you want to carve fine designs into your clay. A needle tool is not a good tool to use for carving. Honestly though, no matter what you do, you are going to end up with crusties, and you're not going to be able to fix them all while your piece is leather hard. You can eliminate the majority of your crusties by using a wet paintbrush or waiting until your piece is bone dry and then flicking off the little crusties. Your clay starts drying out the minute you expose it to air. You're going to be responsible for your own block of clay, and part of that responsibility is going to be keeping it a good consistency, which means that the only clay you should ever have unwrapped is the clay you are actively working with. The rest of your clay always needs to be kept wrapped in plastic. Plastic is the only thing that will keep your clay as wet as it needs to be. When you rewrap your clay at the end of a class, you want to squeeze out as much air from your bag as you possibly can. You can also take your artwork, if you are worried about it drying out too much. We're going to be covering our art pieces with plastic as well so they don't dry out. And if we have, say, a weekend or a vacation, we can take wet paper towels, wrap our pieces in those wet paper towels, and we can even spray down our wooden board before we cover them in plastic. Now, there are some important rules to working with clay so your clay piece doesn't come apart in the middle of building. One is you can never add wet clay to dry clay. When you're attaching different pieces together, they have to have the same level of moisture. That is because as clay dries, it shrinks. And if you have 2 different pieces of clay that are 2 different moisture levels, they are shrinking at different rates. For instance, if you put a wet handle onto a bone dry mug, it is going to crack off because it is going to shrink unevenly and shrink off of the piece. This is really important. Do not let your piece dry out. Once your piece dries out, there is very little we can do with it anymore, and you may have to start over. So be sure that you keep it wet enough to be able to keep working on it. If the worst happens and your piece does dry out, talk to me and we can see if we can fix it. But the easiest way is to just keep your piece nice and damp while you're working on it. Now, Because clay shrinks, it is very important to dry it slowly so that it doesn't crack or shrink too quickly, and it's important to dry it evenly. Your clay is not all going to be the same thickness because you're adding decorations and carvings. The thinner parts of your clay are going to dry faster than the thicker parts. So to prevent warping and cracking, we wrap small, delicate areas with little pieces of plastic or wet paper. That slows their drying rate so that it's more even with the rest of the piece. The goal is to keep the whole piece the same moisture level as it dries out. Now, clay doesn't just shrink when it's drying out. It also shrinks when we put it in the kiln and fire it. Let's talk about shrinking while it's still drying out. If you wanted to make a mug and you decided you want it to be perfectly cylindrical and you found a hard tube to wrap your clay around to mold it to that shape, it would not be able to shrink because that hard tube would not move. Because of that, your clay would crack apart. That's why a lot of potters will find a styrofoam or soft foam pool noodle or some other form they can use to mold their clay around. Now, when we fire your piece, it is also going to shrink, which means if you have an idea of how big you want your piece to be when it comes out of the kiln, you've got to make it a little bit larger to begin with. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a tiny form of what you wanted. Our clay that we get from Seattle Pottery Supply shrinks between about 8 and 12%. The picture in front of you shows you a really good idea of what clay looks like as it shrinks. The first image is a piece of bone-dry greenware that has not been fired yet. The second image is a piece of bisqueware that has been fired once. And the last picture is of a glazed piece that has come out and shrunk a second time. All right, clay, as long as it's not fired, as long as it has not been turned into stone, can always be recycled. We do not throw clay away in this studio. So if you end up with clay that you think is unusable, we recycle it. We put it in a bucket with a little bit of moisture, and then we put it in our pug mill. However, your job this trimester is to learn how to take care of your clay long term. So you will be keeping your clay wet enough to use, and if it starts to dry out, I will be showing you how to re-moisten it so that you can use it. So we will not have very much clay to recycle in our class. This is what we already talked about a little bit at the beginning of the year. The main danger to working with clay is the silica in the clay. Silica is a microscopic particle that makes up a large part of the clay body. And when we look at it under a microscope, like the image on the screen, it is very sharp. It is so sharp that when you breathe it into your lungs, it can cut and damage the tissue. And long-term lung irritation from small injuries like that can lead to diseases such as COPD and lung cancer. We talked about how 70% of professional potters end up with lung diseases like that. Now that we know what silica does to the lungs, we hope that potters going forward will be able to protect themselves and their lungs more effectively. Silica is the same dust that causes coal miners to develop black lung. And you can see in the bottom picture why it's called black lung. The black is all the areas of lung tissue that have died from disease, whereas the right image, the right lobe of the lung, is still pink and healthy like it should be. Clearly, these are lungs from two different people, but they gave you the damaged, diseased lung and the pink, healthy lung as a comparison. Silica is so microscopic and so lightweight that if we dust it or we even rub it between our fingertips, it can float in the air for up to 3 days. This is why we never sweep up clay. We don't brush it away with our hands. We don't use dust sweeps. We don't use dustpans, anything like that. We always, always, always use water in clay studios. This is how we clean up anything, and this is how we deal with dust. So, in order to clean our tables and get all of the clay off of them so it doesn't dry into a very smooth, dusty layer, we get our sponge really, really wet, and we scrub the entire table one time. We go and we wash out our sponge really thoroughly because the sponge is saturated with all of these silica particles now. We wring out our sponge and we wipe away as much of the water as possible. Then we go ahead at the end of class and we use dry paper towels to dry the table, and that really gets rid of the last little pieces of clay on the tables. Okay. When you are all done with your projects, the very first thing you're going to do if you think you're done is you're going to check your project for crusties and uneven areas that don't look finished. You always need to show me your piece when you think it's done before you let it dry out. If you wait to let it dry out before you show me, it's often too late to fix anything. The last thing you do is put your finished piece on the greenware shelf in the kiln room, and I will show you where that is, and Miss Spruce and I will fire it for you, getting it ready to glaze. Congratulations, we're done.